Hello, everyone. In these set of videos, I'm going to go over Chapter 9. I'm not going to hit a lot on the biology because a lot of those things are things that you can just look up. But I'm going to try to hit some of the more complex theories that sometimes you need explained in order to really make sense of it. Um, I'm going to begin here talking about uh, developmental psychology in general. Um, Throughout history, there is a question as to how is it that we grow up? That's what developmental psychology is about. How is it that we start out this little bundle of, maybe a cuteness, but can't really do much of anything, um, and we, sort of get older, get bigger, get smarter, get more capable, and then eventually we start to get older. What is that process? And that's developmental psychology. And one of the questions that has persisted throughout history is who we become nature? Is it inborn inside of us? Or is it nurture? Is it something that we learn? And for most of history, people thought that it was nature, that who you were traits that you inherited from your parents, from your family. And although clearly there are things that we inherit from our family, from our parents, um, our genetics, the color of our skin, the color of our eyes, our hair, how much of certain hormones we make or don't make, certain um, diseases. Not everything is nature, but there was a time in history when people really believed everything was nature. And they would say, if your dad's a criminal, you're going to end up becoming a criminal too. And if your father or mother was a socialite and everybody liked them, then that's who you would become as well. Um, and uh, Later in history, closer to modern times, there became this shift in thinking that people in reality come to the world as blank slates. And uh, it is the environment, it is the world that they live in that makes them who they are. Now, the reason this changes throughout history is because of the way the people see the world, right? It's just the natural sort of philosophies that are going around at the time. For most of history, people kind of thought that being in society was good and leaving society was bad, because when people left society out there in the wilderness, in the woods, there were scary things. Some people left and never came back. Um, and people thought of nature, of the natural world, as being sort of bad. The devil is out there, and you want to stay close to society. Um, by the 1700s, a change starts to occur. All of a sudden, society is quite big, and there are cities. And if you happen to live in those cities, it looks like the cities are bad. There's more crime, there's more poor people, um, there is waste, it's dirtier, and all of a sudden, the way people see the world starts to shift, and they start to think, when things were better, when we were closer to nature. And all of a sudden, the idea starts to sort of turn on its head. The natural world is good, and society is bad. And all of a sudden, people start to think people are bad because society makes them bad. And so now nurture starts to take a hold of sort of people's imaginations. The reason you're bad is because of nurture, how you were brought up. But this battle between people who thought nature was more important or nurture was more important continues throughout the centuries. Today, we understand that both are equally as important. There are aspects of your personality, your intelligence, your body that are biological. And there are other aspects of all of those things, of your biology, of your personality, of your intelligence, that are nurtured and depend on the environment. Um, and so, to what degree nurture affects any specific trait, that is sometimes still in contention. People still argue about those things. But for the most part, the science is pretty clear. Almost everything about who you are as a person is affected by both nature and nurture. Now, still talking a little bit about history. There was a time throughout our history where people kind of saw you in one of three ways. You were either a baby, you were an adult, or you were an old person. And by the time you were 8 or 9, people started saying things to you like, hey, you're 8 now, it's time to start working. Or, hey, you're 8 or 9 now, it's time for you to start thinking about becoming a wife. Um, because the average person saw what we today would think of as a kid as needing to be an adult. And people didn't think about or pay attention to how a 9-year-old is different than a grown up. They only noticed, hey, you can do the work now, so you need to start thinking about getting a job or becoming an adult. Now, for the most part, throughout most of history, people started to think of you as an adult, but it was your family. So they weren't going to send you to do dangerous things. They knew your limitations. Although, to be fair, if you were a girl, sometimes you did just get married off. Um, and it sounds crazy, but that is how life was. Until around the 1800s. And around the 1800s, something starts to happen, something starts to change. All of a sudden, people aren't just working in farms anymore. And there is a shift to go work in the city, to go work in manufacturing, in a factory somewhere. And so the adults start to live in the city and start to work in the city. Well, remember those 8 and 9-year-olds? People thought of them as adults. And so they too went off to work in the city and to sort of try to make ends meet in the city. Um, this basically happens because of the Industrial Revolution. All of a sudden, there is more things that can be produced with machinery, more factories, and of course, where the machines are, that's where people have to work, and so they have to come in to work near those machines. And so we saw people get killed by machines, arms being ripped off. And of course, if you're a child, well, those things happen to children as well. But of course, these children weren't working with their families anymore. It was some manager who didn't care about them. And so people start to notice that these children are significantly different than these adults. And so there starts to be a different way of thinking about children. And people start to think of children as being their own stage, and that children should be protected. And sure enough, more laws start to be created, child labor laws, for example, to protect children. And as a society, we sort of break apart adulthood. We start to think of children as children and adults as adults. Right around the same time, however, um, there is a researcher, Stanley G. Hall. And Stanley G. Hall starts to do research and he starts to figure out that, hey, there is yet another stage in the middle, in between childhood and adulthood, which he called adolescence. And he had a lot of research to back it up, but society didn't really catch up to Stanley G. Hall until around the 1950s, when all of a sudden teenagers start to be thought of as a separate stage in development. Now, of course, developmental psychology doesn't stop there. Um, In the culture, however, that is kind of where we stop. People think of infants, children, teens, adults, and old people. But developmental psychology continues to do research, and they continue to break apart these stages. And we start to see that there are different developmental stages. And at one level, a child might be able to do this, and at a different level, the child might be able to do this other thing. And so uh, we often think of childhood as being neonates, that is newborns, um, infants or babies. And then we often think of children as early childhood, middle childhood, and late childhood. Then we have the teens with adolescents, adults, and late adulthood. But sure enough, as the culture has changed, newer stages have emerged. Perhaps one of the most important ones, or the one that is sort of people do the most research on now, is what we call emerging adulthood. There's a good chance that you now are part of emerging adulthood. Um, in the normal way that we think of adults, adulthood would begin around 18 years old and it would continue until your 40s. Well, except that in our culture, there's a big difference between the life of an 18-year-old and the life of a 40-year-old. That's not always true in every culture. In some cultures, you're 18, you get married, you get a job, you start having babies, and you start living your adult life. But in cultures like ours, that doesn't happen. An 18-year-old to even into your 30s, you have a lot of leeway. 20-year-olds and early 30-year-olds are just kind of finding themselves. They might get a job and then they decide, I don't want to do this anymore. And they quit and they go find another job, a different kind of job. They probably go through a couple of relationships that are kind of serious, but sometimes they fall apart. They might leave town and go to a different state or a different country and then maybe come back or move again. There's a lot of movement because in emerging adulthood, you're technically an adult, but you still have a lot of freedom and you get to live life the way you want to. Um, Unlike that adult who has so much responsibility that they're kind of stuck and it's kind of hard to get out of a life that you don't like in the middle of your adulthood.